Emily was sitting in a dimly lit cafe, nervously tapping her fingers on the worn wooden table. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, but she was too anxious to appreciate its comforting aroma. His gaze kept drifting toward the front door, awaiting the arrival of Clara, a woman he had only known for a few weeks. The €5,000 that he had agreed to pay weighed heavily in his bag. He had to empty his savings and borrow from his sister to raise this sum. The service Clara offered was supposed to solve all their problems discreetly, no questions asked. But now, sitting in that cafe where the other customers' conversations seemed distant and confusing, Emily was beginning to doubt. The doorbell rang and Clara entered. Tall, elegant, she crossed the room with a confidence that made several customers turn. Emily felt her heart race. Clara was wearing a charcoal grey suit that made her look like a respectable businesswoman, but something in her eyes worried Emily. "Hello, Emily," Clara said, sitting across from her. His voice was soft, almost honeyed, but his eyes remained cold. "I hope you get what we talked about." Emily nodded, sweaty hands clutching her bag. "Yes, I have collected everything. €5,000, as agreed." Clara slowly swirled her spoon in the cup of coffee she had just ordered. The clanking of metal against porcelain sounded like a countdown in Emily's ears. "Actually," Clara began, leaning forward, "there have been some complications." The word complications was like a cold shower to Emily. She knew this type of tactic, she had seen it in movies, but she never thought she would experience it personally. "Complications," he repeated, his voice betraying his concern. "Things are more complex than expected," Clara explained, her tone becoming harsher. "I will need an additional €5,000 to cover unforeseen expenses." Emily felt the ground slip beneath her feet. "That wasn't the deal," he protested weakly. "I can't. I don't have that amount." Clara shrugged with calculated indifference. "That's not my problem. You want the job done right, right?" Emily's head was buzzing. She was already struggling to make ends meet, and now this. "I will empty my savings to raise the €5,000. I can't find any more." "You're creative, Emily. I'm sure you'll find a solution." Clara's smile was that of a predator. "You have a week." Suddenly the cafe seemed too small, too strange. Emily searched for words, but found nothing. She felt trapped, like a cornered animal. The conversations around him continued, creating a surreal background sound for this scene that was turning his life upside down. "But the deal," Emily began, her voice shaking. Clara interrupted her with a brusque gesture. "The deal has changed. That's how things like this work, Emily. You adapt to the circumstances." Emily looked around, desperately searching for an escape route, a friendly face, anything. But the other customers were absorbed in their own conversations, in their own lives, oblivious to the drama that was unfolding a few meters away from them. "I really can't," Emily insisted, but her voice cracked. He knew Clara wouldn't give up. This woman was used to getting what she wanted. "Look," Clara said, her tone becoming more threatening, "you're already involved. There's no turning back. Either you find the money or—" He left the sentence hanging, but the threat was clear. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. How could she have been so naive? How could he have thought that everything would be so simple? "Maybe I could borrow something from some friends," Emily muttered, more to herself than to Clara. "Do what you want, but find that money." Clara took out her phone and placed it on the table. "I'll send you the payment details. Don't try to betray me, Emily. You wouldn't like the consequences." Emily looked at the phone as if a gun was pointed at her. In a sense, it was. This little device probably contained enough information to ruin your life. The waiter walked past their table and asked if they wanted anything else. Clara ordered another coffee with a charming smile, as if they were two friends chatting. Emily shook her head, unable to speak. "A week," Clara repeated once the waiter left. "Not one more day." Emily tried to mentally calculate her options. Maybe you could sell your car, even if you needed it to get to work. Or borrow from the bank, but with his current credit, that was unlikely. Each possibility seemed more desperate than the last. What happens if I contact the police? The question escaped him before he could suppress it. Clara's laugh was short and icy. Really, Emily? Do you think this is a good idea? Think carefully about the consequences. For you, for your family. Emily felt her courage evaporate. Clara was right. I was trapped. The police couldn't do anything without endangering everything they were trying to protect. I'll find the money, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Wise decision. Clara stood up and straightened her suit with an elegant gesture. 1 week, Emily. I'll contact you with more details. He left as he came, with confidence and grace, leaving behind a broken and terrified Emily. The cafe was still bustling with activity around her, but Emily felt completely isolated, as if she were trapped in a bubble of fear and despair. She sat for what seemed like hours, staring at her now cold cup of coffee. Other customers came and went, the sun began to set, casting longer and longer shadows on the cafe's windows. But Emily didn't move, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. Only when his phone vibrated did he wake up from his slumber. A message from Clara, bank details, followed by a simple tic-tac. The countdown had begun. The week passed in a blur. Emily had managed to raise only a fraction of the requested amount, despite her desperate efforts. Now she found herself in the same cafe again, but this time her husband Mark was sitting a few tables away, supposedly giving her a sense of security. Mark's presence should have calmed her, but it only increased her stress. Clara was 15 minutes late, a deliberate tactic that Emily was sure of. Every minute of waiting had been torture, turning his anxiety into a heavy ball in his stomach. The sound of the door opening startled her and she saw Clara walking towards her, as elegant and intimidating as the last time. So? Clara asked without preamble, sitting down across from Emily. His expensive smell invades the space between them, as suffocating as his presence. Emily took a deep breath. I managed to raise €2,000, he said with a trembling voice. I'll have the rest soon, I promise. I just need a little more time. Clara's face instantly hardened. His normally calculating eyes flashed with barely contained anger. A little more time, he repeated in a dangerously low voice. I gave you a week. 7 full days. I know, Emily stuttered, glancing nervously at Mark, who was stubbornly staring at his phone. But it is more complicated than expected. Banks do not lend easily and… I don't care about your excuses, Clara interrupted, leaning forward. Are you kidding? You think I'm not serious? Emily shook her head sharply. No, not at all. I take this very seriously. It's just… What? Clara's tone rose little by little, attracting the attention of the neighboring tables. That you thought you could manipulate me, make me wait, play me for an idiot. The tension was rising dangerously. Emily felt sweat running down her back and her hands trembled under the table. The other customers began to stare openly at them, some whispering among themselves. Please, Emily whispered, keep your voice down. We can discuss this calmly. Quietly, Clara let out a dry laugh that sounded more like a bark. I've been more than patient with you, Emily. More than reasonable. And this is how you thank me. Emily cast another desperate glance at Mark, but he seemed absorbed in the screen, as if the scene unfolding a few meters away from him did not concern him. Her apparent indifference hurt him almost as much as Clara's threats. I'll find the money, Emily promised, her voice barely audible. I can sell my car, ask for an advance on my salary. Enough. Clara slammed the palm of her hand on the table, surprising several customers. I've had enough of your empty promises. The waiter timidly approached their table. Ladies, is everything okay? Everything is perfectly fine, Clara replied with an icy smile that made him step back. Right, Emily. Emily could only nod weakly and the waiter reluctantly walked away. As soon as she was out of reach, Clara leaned in even closer, her face inches from Emily's. You have until tonight, he hissed. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight. That's not possible, Emily protested weakly. You know that's impossible. This was the last straw. Clara's face transformed and all traces of control disappeared. In an instant, his hand cut through the air and fell violently on Emily's cheek. The sound of the slap echoed in the suddenly silent cafe. The force of the blow sent Emily to the ground, and her chair overturned with a clang. His head hit the cold tiles, and for a moment everything went blurry. He could taste the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, where his teeth had cut into his lip. The cafe was frozen in stunned silence. Conversations had stopped abruptly, cups suspended halfway between lips, all eyes glued to the stage. Emily lay motionless on the floor, her cheek burning and her body shaking with shock and humiliation. Through tears, she looked for Mark. He was still sitting at his table, eyes downcast and hands clutching his phone. His inaction was like a second blow, even more painful than Clara's slap. How could he stand there motionless while she was attacked? Clara was on top of her, standing tall and menacing, without the slightest trace of remorse on her face. "This is what happens when people think I'm an idiot," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Next time it will be worse." Slowly and painfully, Emily stood up. His legs were shaking so much that he had to lean on a nearby table to get up. No one made any move to help him, not even the customers who a few seconds before seemed so worried about the situation. Emily began, but her voice broke. What could she say? How had she gotten there, publicly humiliated in a cafe, while her husband looked the other way? Clara picked up her bag with studied elegance. "Tonight, Emily. Don't let me down again." He left the cafe, leaving behind a heavy silence and a devastated Emily. Little by little the conversations resumed, first in whispers and then more normally. People looked away and returned to their coffees and conversations as if nothing had happened. But Emily stood there, her cheek burning and her world shattered. She looked back at Mark, perhaps hoping that he would finally get up, that he would come to comfort her, to help her, to do something. But he remained seated, still avoiding her gaze, as if he were a mere spectator and not her husband, her supposed protector. A waitress approached timidly and handed him a damp napkin. "Do you want me to call someone?" he asked softly. "Maybe the police." Emily shook her head and wiped away her tears angrily. "No," she whispered. "It would only make things worse." He gathered his things with trembling hands, ignoring the looks of pity or curiosity from the other customers. Anger began to replace fear and humiliation. An anger directed not only against Clara, but also against Mark, against herself, against this whole situation that had gotten out of her control. When she left the cafe, she didn't look to see if Mark was following her. For the first time, he felt a new strength born within him, born of humiliation and betrayal. I would no longer be a victim. It was time to regain control. The trip home passed in icy silence. Emily drove with her hands tight on the wheel, while Mark looked out the window, as if fascinated by the urban landscape he saw every day. The heavy traffic gave them an excuse not to talk, but Emily's questions bubbled up and threatened to spill over at any moment. When they finally got home, Emily slammed the door with more force than necessary. The noise echoed across the driveway and scared a neighborhood cat. Mark followed her like a shadow to the front door, still keeping that careful distance between them, as if he feared an imminent explosion. As soon as she entered the living room, Emily turned around abruptly. "Are you finally going to explain it to me?" His voice shook with suppressed anger. Mark avoided her gaze and fiddled with the keys. "Explain what? Explain what?" Emily repeated, incredulous. "Are you kidding, I hope? You were there, Mark. You saw it all. You saw that woman slap me, throw me to the ground, and you did nothing. Absolutely nothing." "I didn't mean to make the situation worse," he muttered, heading toward the kitchen as if to escape the confrontation. Emily followed him, refusing to let him escape. "Making things worse? I was on the floor, Mark. On the floor, in a crowded cafe, while my husband sat staring at his phone like nothing was happening." Mark grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, a gesture so mundane it was surreal under the circumstances. "What did you want me to do? Fight her? Cause an even bigger scene? A bigger stage?" Emily's voice rose an octave. "She attacked me. Anyone, any stranger in this cafe could have intervened. But you, my husband, sat there pretending not to see anything." Mark took a long drink of beer, leaning against the kitchen counter. His face revealed growing concern, but also something else, something Emily couldn't identify. "You don't understand," he finally said, looking at the floor. It's more complicated than that. Then explain it to me, Emily insisted, approaching him. Because I really don't understand it. I don't understand how the man I married, the man who promised to protect me, could remain impassive while I was attacked. The silence that followed was deafening. In the family kitchen where they had shared so many happy moments, the atmosphere had become suffocating. The photos on the refrigerator, witnesses of their past happiness, now seemed to mock them. Are you afraid of him? Emily suddenly asked, as a new possibility arose in her mind. Did she threaten you too? Mark shook his head, but too quickly and too nervously. No, that's not it. So what? Emily felt tears fill her eyes, but this time they were tears of frustration. What are you hiding from me, Mark? Mark's silence spoke louder than any response. Emily watched him, noticing for the first time the little details she'd missed over the past few weeks. His bags under his eyes, the way he jumped when his phone rang, his inexplicable absences. How long has it been? He asked quietly, as a new understanding slowly settled. What are you talking about? Mark's response was too quick, too defensive. You know her, right? Clara. This isn't the first time you've seen her. Mark put down his beer with a thud. His hands were shaking slightly. Emily, please. No, she interrupted, her voice becoming firmer. No more please, no more excuses. I want the truth. At least you owe me that. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly aged by the weight of secrets kept for too long. Can't. You can't what? Emily's anger was rising again. Can't you be honest with your wife? Can't you explain why you sat while a woman assaulted me? Mark began to pace around the kitchen, like a caged animal. You don't understand the situation we are in. Us. Emily said. There's no we, Mark. There's me, on the floor of that cafe, and you, looking away. So explain it to me. Make me understand. The silence stretched on, interrupted only by the sound of Mark's footsteps on the tiles and the incessant ticking of the wall clock. Emily waited, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. Every passing second confirmed his growing suspicions. I'm going to make some coffee, he finally said, turning to the coffee pot. This everyday gesture gave him something to do, an anchor in this increasingly surreal reality. I don't want coffee, Mark muttered. It's not for you. Emily's voice was calm now, almost indifferent. I'm going to make some coffee and you're going to sit down. And you're going to tell me everything. Absolutely everything. Mark looked at her for a long moment, as if he were really seeing her for the first time. This woman in front of him was no longer the same one who had left the house this morning. Something had changed, had hardened inside her. Okay, he said finally, sitting down heavily at the kitchen table. Okay. But you're not going to like what you hear. Emily placed 2 cups on the table and the sound of porcelain echoed in the tense silence. I don't like any of this anymore, Mark. But I need to know. I need to understand why my husband abandoned me when I needed him most. She sat across from him, her hands clenched around her hot mug. The black coffee reflected their tense faces, like a dark mirror of their marriage that was cracking a little more with each second. Start at the beginning, he said quietly. How did you meet Clara? Mark took a deep breath, like a man about to plunge into deep, dangerous waters. The story he was about to tell would change everything, they both knew it. But they had already passed the point of no return. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but neither Emily nor Mark touched it. The steaming cups remained intact between them, like a symbolic barrier. Mark stared at the table, tracing invisible patterns with his fingertip. I met Clara 6 months ago, he finally began, his voice barely more than a whisper. At first it was a trivial matter in the office. She represented a potential client. Emily remained silent, waiting for what happened next. He noticed that Mark's hands were shaking slightly. At first everything seemed normal. Business meetings, contracts to negotiate. But one day he called me into his office after hours. He had discovered something. He stopped and took a sip of the now lukewarm coffee. Emily could see sweat dripping on his forehead. That year, when the company was going through a bad time, I falsified some documents. I thought no one would notice, that it was temporary, just to get us out of the red. But Clara found out. Emily felt her stomach drop. Did you commit fraud? I wanted to save the company, save our jobs. I thought I could fix things before anyone noticed. He laughed bitterly. But Clara, she sees everything. And she blackmailed you, Emily added, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Mark nodded. At first, it was small amounts. She said it was to keep things secret. Then the amounts increased. Every time I thought she was done, she would come back with new demands. Emily stood up abruptly, unable to sit still. He started pacing the kitchen, his mind racing. Is that why our savings have melted in the last few months? Is that where the money has gone? I didn't know what to do, Mark whispered. If she talks, I lose my job, I go to prison. Everything we have built. So you let him threaten me? You hit me. Emily's voice shook with suppressed anger. Did you see her destroy me to protect your secret? Mark put his head in his hands. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't think he'd go this far. When he started threatening you, I got scared. Emily stopped in front of the kitchen window and looked out over the quiet garden. The rose bushes they had planted together last year were in bloom, unaware of the drama unfolding inside them. How much did you give him in total? Almost 100,000 euros, Mark admitted quietly. Emily turned around so quickly that her coffee cup wobbled on the table. 100,000 euros? How? Where did you find all this money? I sold stocks, emptied our savings account, and borrowed everywhere. Mark seemed to move in his chair with each word. I even mortgaged the house. What did you do? Emily's voice was barely audible. Without telling me. I forged your signature, he admitted, eyes glued to the ground. I know it's unforgivable, but I was desperate. Emily had to lean against the counter to keep from falling. Each new revelation was like a stab. The man she thought she knew and with whom she had shared her life for 10 years turned out to be a stranger. And now, he asked after a long silence. What is happening now? Mark took out his phone and placed it on the table. She sends me messages every day. Threats, demands for money. I don't know what to do anymore. Emily walked over and picked up the phone. The messages flashed before their eyes, months of blackmail and manipulation. Clara knew exactly which buttons to press, how to hold the pressure without releasing it. Show me the documents, he said suddenly. The ones you forged. Emily. Show me, he insisted. If we want to get out of this nightmare, I need to know everything. Reluctantly, Mark got up and went to get his laptop. His hands were shaking so much that he had to try to type his password several times. Emily sat next to him and watched as the files were opened one by one. The more he read, the more his heart sank. It wasn't just a few tweaked numbers here and there. It was an elaborate system of false invoices, rigged accounts, and ingenious embezzlement. Mark may have started out with good intentions, but he had become deeply immersed in lawlessness. Do you realize that Clara will never stop? He finally said. As long as she has this power over you, over us, it will continue. Mark nodded sadly. I don't know how to get out of this. Emily slammed the computer shut. A new determination shone in his eyes. I know. Mark looked at her surprised. What do you mean? Let's trick her at her own game. Emily stood up and began to gather the documents scattered on the table. Did you keep records of all the payments you made to him? Yes, and you recorded his threats, his messages? Yes, but Emily, we can't go to the police. If this story gets out. We're not going to the police. Not yet. Emily pulled out her own phone. I know someone who could help us. Someone who knows how to handle this type of situation. For the first time since this conversation began, a glimmer of hope crossed Mark's eyes. Are you sure? No, Emily admitted. But one thing I know for sure, I won't let her destroy our lives. She thinks she has all the power, but she made a mistake. Which? She underestimated me. Emily looked her husband straight in the eyes. She thought I was weak, that I would give up. She doesn't know who she's dealing with. Mark looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. This strong and determined woman who stood before him was a far cry from the one who was trembling in the cafe a few hours before. The metamorphosis was as fascinating as it was terrifying. "What are we going to do?" he asked softly. "Let's set him up," Emily replied. "And this time we are the ones who will dictate the rules of the game." The next morning, Emily was sitting in the kitchen, her laptop open in front of her and a steaming cup of coffee within her reach. He had barely slept and spent the night hatching his plan. Mark was still sleeping upstairs, exhausted from the revelations of the previous day. His phone vibrated. It was Sophie, her childhood friend who had become a police inspector. "Can I see you in an hour?" asked the familiar voice on the other end of the line. "At the Café des Artistes," Emily suggested. "The one that is far from the center." "Perfect." "And Emily, come alone." The Café des Artistes was a small, discreet establishment, frequented mainly by art students from the neighboring school. Sophie was already ensconced in a remote corner when Emily arrived. His short hair and casual appearance gave no indication of his profession. "You look exhausted," Sophie noted as Emily sat up. "I've seen better days." Emily took out a USB drive from her bag. "I need your help, but what I'm about to show you has to stay between us. At least for now." Sophie grabbed the USB drive and her face hardened as she looked at the documents on her laptop. Clara's messages, the bank statements, the evidence of the blackmail, everything was carefully organized. "It's serious, Emily," he finally said. "Very serious. Do you realize that your husband has committed several crimes?" "I know." Emily grabbed her coffee cup. "But Clara is worse. She doesn't just blackmail. She uses violence, threats. And I'm sure we're not her only victims." Sophie continued flipping through the documents. "Do you want me to do some research on her?" Unofficially, Emily clarified. "I don't want to press charges. Not yet. First I want to understand who we're dealing with." "You're playing a dangerous game," Sophie warned. "This woman is not the type to back down easily." "I won't back down either." Emily's voice was firm. "She made the mistake of believing that I was weak. That I would settle for being a victim." Sophie watched her friend with a mixture of concern and admiration. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "I want to turn their own system against them." Emily leaned forward and lowered her voice. "He works on fear, on the shame of his victims. But what if we were no longer afraid? What if we had evidence that he does the same with other people?" Sophie thought for a moment. "You could do a discreet investigation. See if any other complaints have been filed, even if they didn't come to fruition. And I'm sure Mark isn't the only executive she's blackmailing," Emily added. "There must be others, in other companies." "You want to build a case against her," Sophie understood. "Gather enough evidence so she can't get away with it." "Exactly." Emily took another document out of her bag. "I have already started investigating his past. There are gray areas, periods where it seems to disappear completely." Sophie examined the document carefully. "You're right. These interruptions to their trip, it's not normal. I can go into that further." "There's something else," Emily continued. "I want to arrange a meeting with her. One last confrontation." "It's too dangerous," Sophie protested immediately. "Not if we prepare it correctly." Emily took out a small device from her bag. "I bought this morning. It's a high-quality recorder. Next time I watch it, every word will be recorded." Sophie shook her head. "You can't use that in court. Not without his consent." "I'm not looking to use her in court. Not right away. I want her to know that we have evidence. That we can destroy her as easily as she thinks she can destroy us." Silence settled between the two friends. In the distance you could hear the noise of coffee machines and the muffled conversations of other customers. "Do you realize this is risky?" Sophie finally said. "If she finds out what you're doing." "She already hit me in public," Emily replied with a bitter smile. "What can she do with worse things?" "Many things," Sophie replied seriously. "People retreat into nothingness when they feel threatened." Emily nodded. "That's why I need your help. I want everything to be perfectly prepared. There is no room for improvisation." Sophie sighed deeply. "It's okay. I'm going to help you. But we do this my way. With guarantees, precautions. Whatever you want." First of all, you won't face it alone anymore. Ever. Sophie took out a small notebook and started taking notes. Then we created a surveillance system. I know trustworthy people who can help us. Emily listened carefully and took notes on her phone. The plan was taking shape, stronger and more complex than he had imagined. And Marcos? Sophie asked. Are you sure he won't miss it all? Emily hesitated for a moment. He's terrified. But he knows we have no choice. Clara will never stop. He'll have to be strong, Sophie warned. This type of operation only works if everyone plays their role perfectly. So it will be, Emily said with more conviction than she really felt. He has no choice. We no longer have a choice. Sophie closed her computer. All right. When do we start? Now, Emily replied. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. The two women stood up, their plan already taking shape in their minds. Emily felt adrenaline rush through her veins, a mix of fear and excitement. For the first time in weeks, he felt in control of the situation. One last thing, Sophie said when they left coffee. Do not underestimate Claire. People like them always have a step ahead. Emily nodded. I know. That's why our plan must be perfect. We will not have a second chance. The restaurant chosen for the confrontation was a luxury establishment in the city center. Emily had deliberately chosen a public but discreet place, where the spaced tables allowed private conversations. The hidden recorder in her bag captured every noise, every whisper. Sophie and her team were scattered in the room, posing as common and currents. Emily had barely recognized them upon entering, proof of her professionalism. Mark was sitting in the bar, nervous but determined, playing his role in his carefully orchestrated plan. Emily reviewed her phone for the last time. Clara's message was brief. I arrive in 5 minutes. I hope you have good news. The 5 minutes that followed seemed to last an eternity. Emily observed his reflection in the window, checking that the small microphone hidden in his neck was fine in his place. It no longer seemed the terrified woman of coffee. His black tailor gave him a professional appearance, he said. His hands were no longer trembling. Clara entered exactly at the scheduled time, as always impeccably dressed. Her sufficient smile went out slightly when she saw that Emily was waiting for her with a glass of wine, perfectly relaxed. You seem in a good mood, he noticed while he was sitting. I hope you mean you have my money. Emily took a sip of wine before answering. In fact, I have something better than that. I have a proposal to make you. Clara arched an eyebrow, surprised by this change in attitude. A proposal? Really? Yeah. Emily took an envelope from her bag. But first, I would like you to take a look at this. The envelope contained photographs, bank readings, copies of messages. Emily had carefully selected, building her partner piece by piece. He observed Clara's face as she tore the documents, noticing the slight thread of her lips, the sudden tension in her jaw. What's that? Clara asked, his voice losing the usual insurance. You recognize some names, right? Emily leaned forward. Pierre Dumont, for example. Or Michel Laurent. Respectable businessmen. All victims of blackmail. All with the same story to tell. Clara separated the documents, trying to keep calm. If you try to threaten me. Threatening you? Emily let out some laugh. No, Claire. I only show you that I finally understand how you work. It's a business for you, don't you find the defects, exploit weaknesses? Very lucrative. The server approached to take your order. Clara returned it with a sudden gesture, her sophistication mask began to break. You don't know what you are getting on, he whistled once the server left. Otherwise. Emily launched a second above. I know exactly what I do. This envelope contains information about its activities in Bordeaux 3 years ago. Very interesting to see how it disappeared just after several executives of the same company were ruined. Clara's face turned slightly. For the first time, Emily saw a trace of fear. What do you want? Clara asked, his voice just more than a whisper. What do I want? Emily straightened in her chair. I want you to disappear from our lives. Completely. More threats, no more blackmail, nothing. Clara quickly returned to its component. You blush. You have no real evidence. Do you want to bet? Emily launched her phone and moved through a series of messages. I talked to their other victims. Some are ready to testify. Others have maintained traces of their threats, their money requests. They will never dare, Clara replied, but his insurance sounded false. Do you think? Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice. Fear is something strange, clear. Sometimes paralyzes. But sometimes pushes people to act. To fight. The restaurant exploded around it, but in its tension bubble, the silence was deafening. Clara looked extended before her, her mind visibly calculated her options. Let's admit, he said finally. What prevents me from disappearing with all the money I already have? Oh, but I thought about it too. Emily launched a last over. I have returned above all your accounts. All your investments. If disappearing, this information will be transmitted to the tax authorities of 3 different countries. Clara cleaned her fists on the table. You lie. Actually, Emily showed him the screen of his phone. These bank extracts in Geneva seem familiar to you. For the first time, Clara really seemed to be destabilized. His gaze swept the room, as if he were looking for an escape. You can't win, Emily continued. Not this time. The only question is whether you want to leave now, with dignity, or if you prefer that everything explodes outdoors. Do you threaten me? Clara's voice was trembling slightly. No, I give you an exit. More than you have given your victims. Clara remained silent for a long time, her look fixed on the documents before her. Emily could almost see that the gears turned into her mind, evaluating each option, each possible result. What guarantees me that you will not speak once I have gone? Finally, he asked Clara. The same that guarantees me that you will really disappear, mutual interest. Emily picked up the documents and put them back in her bag. Go, you keep the money you already have, and everyone continues their life. But if you come back, if you try to threaten us again. She left her prayer in suspense, the perfectly clear message. Clara got up slowly, smoothing her skirt with a mechanical gesture. His insurance mask returned, but Emily could see the cracks. You changed, Clara said. Thanks to you, Emily replied with a cold smile. You taught me that sometimes you have to fight. Clara picked up her bag, preparing to leave. Do you know that this type of victory has a price? I know. But some things are worth this price. Clara nodded slightly, a gesture that almost seemed respect. Then he turned his heels and left the restaurant, his right, his guaranteed approach, as if left after a simple business lunch. Emily was sitting, looking at the door closing behind her. It was only then that he allowed his hands to tremble, adrenaline reflected. She had won, but Clara was right, victory had a bitter taste. The days after Clara's departure happened in a strange fog. Emily and Mark played at home as ghosts, speaking little, avoiding difficult issues. The silence between them was responsible for everything that remained to be said, of all the wounds that had still cured. One night, while Emily put dinner's dishes, Mark approached her, an envelope in her hand. I made an appointment, he said slowly. With a marriage therapist. If you want. Emily put the dish that she cleaned, looking at the envelope containing the presentation card. Dr. Marie LeBlanc, specialist in marital and family therapy. Do you think it can help us? He asked, his voice betrayed his skepticism. I don't know, Mark admitted. But I know I don't want to lose you. And I know what happened, what I did. You can't repair with simple excuses. Emily took the envelope, examining the card. The cabinet was in a quiet area, far from the center of the city, far from the places that reminded them of Clara. It's fine, he said finally. We can try. The first meeting was more difficult than they had imagined. Sitting in the warm office of the LeBlanc doctor, they found the scale of the damage caused by lies and secrets. How do you feel now that this woman has left your lives? The therapist asked. Emily looked at her crossed hands on her lap. Revealed. But also, empty. As if everything that happened had created a void among us, and I don't know how to fill it. Mark nodded. Sometimes I wake up at night, thinking that everything was a nightmare. So I remember that it was real, that I really did all these things. Trust, LeBlanc's doctor intervened. It's like a beautiful vase. Once he broke, we can return it, but patience, precision and, above all, the two people want the solution is needed. Emily felt tears putting her eyes. I want to fix it. But I'm afraid. He fears will happen again, fear of never being able to trust completely. It's a legitimate fear, replied the therapist. And Mark, how do you handle this fear in Emily? Mark ran a hand on his tired face. I would like to be able to erase all this. I return and make the right decisions. But I cannot. So, I try to be present, to be honest, even when it is difficult. It is difficult. Dr. LeBlanc noticed something in his notebook. The reconstruction of trust is a process. Take time, commitment, and especially absolute honesty. Are you ready for that? Emily and Mark exchanged a look. For the first time in weeks, they really seemed to see each other, beyond injuries and betrayals. The therapy sessions became a weekly ritual. Every Wednesday, they met Dr. LeBlanc's office, gradually unpacking the layers of lies and without saying that they had accumulated among them. At home, they began establishing new habits. Mark left his unlocked phone, shared his passwords, showed a total transparency in his professional activities. It was not surveillance, but rather gestures of goodwill, small steps towards reconstruction. Emily, meanwhile, learned to administer her own changes. The experience with Clara had transformed it, giving her a force that was not known. Sometimes, this new insurance created unforeseen tensions in its couple dynamics. You are no longer the same, Mark told him one night, as they walked in his neighborhood, a new habit they had led to speak. No, I'm no longer, Emily admitted. Do you care? Mark thinks for a moment before answering. No. It impresses me, in fact. You were much stronger than me in this story. It's not a matter of strength, Emily replied softly. It is a question of choice. You have made bad decisions, but now you do them well. Weeks spent, becoming months. Little by little, the moments of tension decreased, replaced by a new form of intimacy, more deep, more authentic. They were freeing themselves to trust each other, but also to know each other, as if the terrible experience he had crossed had transformed them into new versions of themselves. One night, while preparing dinner together, Emily received a message from Sophie. Clara News, who had been seen abroad, far from their lives. Emily looked at the message for a moment, then removed it. Everything's fine? Mark asked, noticing his hesitation. Yes, she replied, and for the first time for a long time, it was true. I think let's get out of that. Mark placed the knife he used to cut the vegetables. How can you be sure? Emily approached him, putting a hand on his arm. Because we both work in the same direction now. We no longer hide anything, we no longer flee. That night, lying on his bed, they spoke for hours, as they had not done for years. Of their fears, their hopes, their projects for the future. Clara's presence in their lives had been like a poison, but perhaps the antidote had been there from the beginning. Honesty, the will to fight together instead of one against the other. I love you, Mark whispered in the dark. The new you, the old you, all versions of you. Emily hugged her hand in his. I love you too. Even with our scars. It was a new beginning, not perfect, but real. The wounds were cured slowly, leaving brands that would always remind them of what had happened, but also what they had managed to overcome together. It had been a year since the confrontation with Clara. Autumn seems like the trees in their golden tones, and Emily observed this change from the window of his new office. After the test he had done, he had decided to take a new turn to his career, leaving his old position to create his own consulting business. Your phone vibrates on the desktop. A Mark message, do not forget, dinner with Sophie tonight. I'm going to get you at 7 p.m. She smiles while reading the message. These little daily attention, previously considered acquired, now had a particular flavor. The day passed quickly, scored by meetings with clients and calls of visionferents. Emily had discovered a natural talent to help others go through crisis situations. His personal experience was so painful, he had given him a unique perspective about resilience and adaptation to change. At 6:45 p.m., he began to put his things. Her gaze met a supervised photo on her desk, She and Mark during her last vacation in Brittany, smiling at the ocean. It was his first trip from the incident, a way to mark his new beginning. Mark arrived on time, as always now. This punctuality, this reliability, was one of the changes he had made in his life. He was no longer the man who hid behind lies and secrets. "Good day?" he asked when they walked to the car. "Productive," Emily replied. "I have signed a new contract with a company that is going through a restructuring. They need help to manage change." Mark nodded, including the implement. "You have become an expert in crisis management." "We can say that," he smiles. "Life has a fun way to prepare for our future." During the trip to Sophie, they talked about their projects, their dreams for the future. Communication between them had become more natural, more honest. The silences were no longer responsible for the not seriously and the secrets. "You know," Mark said when they approached Sophie's house, "today I was thinking about something." "And then what?" "I wondered what would have happened if Clara had never entered our lives. If I had made the right decisions from the beginning." Emily is thinking for a moment. "I think we sometimes need to cross the fire to strengthen ourselves. It is not the test itself, but what we do with it." The night in Sophie was warm and animated. His friend had been promoted to the main inspector, and they were there to celebrate. The house resonated with laughter and conversations, a surprising contrast with the dark moments that had passed a year earlier. Success. Sophie threw her glass. And to the new beginnings. Emily and Mark exchanged an accomplice appearance. They knew that Sophie referred much more than her promotion. Later at night, while the guests began to leave, Sophie separated from Emily in the kitchen. "News?" Emily asked, knowing that her friend always had an eye on Clara's activities. "Nothing for months," Sophie replied. "It seems to have definitely left the country." "You were right. You prefer to avoid clashes when you don't have the advantage." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. "It's better like that." "And you too?" Sophie asked, looking at the program where Mark spoke with other guests. "How is really good?" "It's fine," Emily replied sincerely. "It is not perfect, it will probably never be, but it is real. We learned to be honest with each other, even when it is difficult." On the way back, Emily looked at family streets by moving through the window. The city seemed different now, as if the proof that had happened had changed its perception of everything. "What do you think?" Mark asked, noticing his reflexive air. "I think of us. All the way we have traveled." She turned to him. "You know, when I was on the ground in this coffee, I thought everything had ended. I could never forgive you, that our life was destroyed." Mark slightly hugged the steering wheel. "And now? Now, I know that sometimes everything has to collapse to be able to rebuild something more solid." She put her hand on her. "We are stronger than before, more real too." When they got home, they stayed in the car for a while, looking at their house illuminated by the moon. The same house that had witnessed so many secrets and lies was now his refuge, his new beginning. "Are we going to return?" Mark proposed gently. Emily smiles. "We return." Hand in hand, they walked towards their main door. The future was not written, but now they knew they could face any storm together. His story was not that of a perfect couple, but that of a couple who had chosen to fight for their love, to rebuild after the storm. And perhaps that was, ultimately, true love, not the absence of obstacles, but the will to overcome them.